Serious, what was your creepy, unexplainable story as a child that was confirmed by your parents to have happened? One time my brother, his friend, and I saw lights in the sky that darted around like UFOs. We went to get my mom and she was totally nonchalant about it. Yep. Those are UFOs, she said. And went back in the house. Her response was so subdued that we figured she was humoring us and they weren't actually UFOs. Years later I asked her about it and she said she had to force herself to act calmly because she was terrified. I saw something like this once. Me and a friend were down at the beach at night and I was looking at this light in the sky. It was moving in a line a little faster than an airplane, then all of a sudden darted off to the side, then back up at an angle and disappeared. My friend saw it too. Was freaky as. I woke up one night when I was 12 because I dreamt that my older brother got into a car accident. I got out of bed and wandered downstairs to the kitchen to get something to drink. My mother was sitting there and asking me why I was awake. I told her I had a bad dream and need something to drink. I got a glass of water when it ringed at our door. My mother went to look who was there in the middle of the night. 2 police officers that asked if they could come inside for a moment. I couldn't hear what they were talking about because I was still in the kitchen and they were in the hallway. After the 2 officers left, my mother came back to the kitchen completely pale and told me that I should go to bed now. I asked her what's wrong when she informed me that my brother was in a car accident and she needs to wake up my dad and go to the hospital now. When I pointed out that this was the bad dream I had before waking up, she only looked at me for a couple of seconds. I prepared myself for comments like don't be silly and go to bed now, but instead she said me too. So basically, we both had the same f-king dream of my brother having a car accident. And we both woke up minutes before the police came over to tell us it really happened. My brother survived with some minor injuries and we've seen the photos of the accident in the newspaper the next day. It looked 100% like in my dream. To the smallest detail. The way he lost control over the car. Where it flipped the first time and the tree it came to a stop. Even today my mother and I talk about this. Nobody else believes us when we tell the story. I have also seen various shadow beings. And so too have my parents. When I was young I woke one night to hear my mother screaming. Being tired I didn't do anything. Assuming it was part of a dream. I asked my mum about the scream in the morning. And she told me that she woke up and saw a shadow man standing at the bottom of her bed. It was only my father telling her that there was nothing there that calmed her down and sent her back to sleep. He hears my mum's story and confesses that he lied to her. That he saw the same figure but didn't want to scare my mum. Years later I moved out into a flat. I wake one night to see a dark figure hovering over my bed. I ended up shouting at it, causing it to run away. My flatmate told me he heard me but thought I could handle myself. Me and the same flatmate ended up moving to a flat across the street, where again I saw another shadow person running through my room. I eventually moved again to an old house where I saw shadow figures on at least 2 occasions. My girlfriend ended up moving in and she would hear things and felt that something was wrong with the house. My parents' dog came to stay when they went away on holiday and he was nervous. He ended up positioning himself facing the door as if he was watching for something. Shortly after that we got a dog of our own. We never saw anything ever again. Ended up moving to a new build house and have not seen anything. A funny story from my father. When he was young he lived in a house he was sure was haunted. He walked past the stairs and looked up to see this beautiful girl around his age. The next time he looked up those same stairs, hoping to see the same woman, he instead saw a large and angry looking man. When my family went to the Georgian mountain region, we rented a cottage. 2 bedrooms. So my brother and I took one and our dad took the other with his GF. I woke up in the middle of the night to 3 figures in the room. All standing in various places. None of which were visible from the entrance of the room. I woke my brother up and we screamed for our dad. But when he came into the room, he refused to look at the figures and just told us to hide under the covers. Wasn't exactly confirmed. But his refusal to look where they were standing after begging him was telling. He still scares my brother and I. Edit. I emailed my dad and all he said back was that he wished he had looked. God damn it, you're supposed to say they were just shadows. So I don't actually remember this, but my mom told me about it. My grandfather died when I was a year old. Prior to his death, he loved to play with me and would make me laugh in this very specific way. The night he died, my mom heard me making noise. So she goes in assuming I'm crying, but I'm not. I'm staring at the ceiling, laughing hysterically just like my grandfather used to make me laugh. She's still convinced he came to say goodbye to me. At my parents' house I used to hear my mom calling out to me when she didn't. And she confirmed she'd hear me call out to her when I didn't. That was a common occurrence. Also, whenever I'd be alone for a little while, if my mom was late from work or at the grocery store, I'd usually be in the main living room playing N64. I would oftentimes hear loud banging sounds from upstairs as if a heavy piece of furniture tipped over. I'd go check and nothing was out of place. Both my mother and grandmother have confirmed similar experiences when they're alone in the house. There was also the time I was downstairs on my laptop. Everyone else was in bed. It was after midnight and I didn't realize just how dark everything had gotten without the lights on. I'm zoned out when I begin to hear what sounds like a murmuring from behind me. Like the low rumble you'd hear at a gathering when people are talking and you can't make out conversation. The hairs on my neck immediately stood up and my body locked up from fear. Tears ran down my face from the physical reaction my body was having. I refused to acknowledge it and kept staring at my laptop screen in silence. It took forever for my body to go back to normal. Some time later I told my mother what happened and it freaked her out because she said she's heard the murmuring as well. I've always hated that house. My grandmother was a real estate agent in Rhode Island. I was staying with her one summer and she had to take me along to see a potential listing. It was a very strange house because it was circular. All the rooms went along the outside and connected to each other, and there was a center part with a little garden and open to the sky. She went up to the second story and I stayed downstairs because I wanted to walk around the loop one time. The problem started when I had walked a full loop and I didn't see the stairs. I thought I must be confused, so I kept going to the next room and still couldn't find them. I started to panic, so I began running around the house as fast as possible, checking every room for stairs, and there wasn't any. Finally, I sat down by the front door and started crying. A little while later my grandmother ran into the entryway room looking just as panicked as I had been and asking where I was hiding and why I was hiding and not answering her calling out to me. I never heard her calling out to me at all. Actually, the house seemed so still and quiet while I was sitting there that I was sure she had forgotten and left me there. We went home and didn't talk about it really. Like 15 years later I brought it up to my mom and asked if she knew anything, or was this a crazy childhood nightmare I'm remembering? She told me she remembered it clearly because my grandmother had called her and was absolutely spooked because she couldn't explain what had happened and she thought she lost me or I had been taken by someone while she was distracted. She had apparently been looking for me for a while. I still don't understand what happened really because the house wasn't even large or confusing to navigate. I still get chills when I think about it. Not necessarily creepy, but when I was around 11 or so, my mom and I were going about 40 miles outside of town for a typical orthodontist appointment. The trip typically took about 35 minutes, give or take a few for traffic. However, this one time I kinda zoned out while being driven, and upon arriving we remarked, "Wow, that was fast." We were earlier for my appointment than usual despite leaving at a consistent time for each appointment. Upon looking at our vehicle's clock and confirming with a watch my mom had on, it had mysteriously taken us only 10 minutes to drive the usual 35-minute distance. We have no recollection of anything happening during those 10 minutes. And it never happened again. But it left us with a very weird feeling. We still wonder what we drove through to this day. About 5 years ago my parents were sitting out on the back porch on a summer night. Out of the corner of her eye my mom saw a person-sized white translucent figure float by a tree. She asked my dad if he saw it too and he said yes. He is a tough guy but he was really freaked out and so was she, so they both went inside. The next morning my mom was walking by the tree where they saw the figure and she noticed a very old looking earring sitting on top of the dirt. She doesn't wear earrings and it wasn't the kind of earring I would wear. It looked like it belonged to an old lady and it was just dropped there. My mom brought it inside and put it in her jewelry box. The next day it was sitting in the middle of the basement floor. From then on I started hearing footsteps and whispering in my room at least once a week until I moved out. I'm a parent of toddlers and kids now. And I have a creepy story from last year. We were driving with my then 3-year-old son in the car. And stopped at a red light next to a cemetery. Out of nowhere, my son looked over at the cemetery and said there are people laying down there. And they can't get up. Double quote. My wife asked my son what he was talking about and he pointed to the cemetery and said all of the people laying down in the park are stuck. Double quote. My wife and I just looked at each other in silence, completely freaked out. At this point in our son's life, there had been no deaths in the family and we had never discussed death with him. I'm still creeped out when I think about it. When I was young, I apparently had a few odd interactions with animals. I would know a person had animals before we went in the house. They tended to come over to me before my parents. Mostly just little things that were probably explainable by me, a fairly observant little kid. The one that sticks out to my parents though, telling it the way they do, is we went to a new car garage to have them work on our car. As we pull up, the owner has a big old black lab laying in the middle of the lobby. The guy informs us the dog is comfortable with people. We can pet him if we want. I shake my head and say he's sado. Dad looks at me, asks why I think that. I reply he lost his ball. He's sad now. Dad said the owner went pale. Stared at me for a minute. And then looked at Dad, said he's had a favorite ball for 10 years that just went down the sewage drain yesterday and I couldn't get it back out. Double quote. Kind of the opposite, but I distinctly remember sitting in the front seat of a van with one of my mother's acquaintances whilst she went to collect something. The guy told me in detail about cutting up, cooking and eating humans. He said palms were a delicacy you could fry up like bacon. Only occurred to me as an adult that he was probably lying. When I was little, probably about 5, my great-grandmother passed away from cancer. We were very close. She watched me nearly every day and would sing to me before my naps. You Are My Sunshine in particular. It was a few days after she died and I can instinctively remember waking up to someone stroking my hair and singing You Are My Sunshine. At first, I thought it was my mom. But it was unlike her to do something like that. I turned and found no one there. I even remember getting up and checking my parents' room to find they were both asleep. Both my parents kind of just nonchalantly dismiss it. But I swear it was her saying goodbye to me. The shoelace. I woke up one morning and the shoelace from one of my sneakers had completely vanished. Just on one shoe. The lace on the other shoe was still there. I do not ever remove the laces of my shoes. The shoes were right beside me by my bed all night. I have always been a ridiculously light sleeper. The slightest sound wakes me up. Nothing woke me that night. Moreover, the door was closed to my room. The floorboards creaked whenever anyone stepped on them. And the room was small. I 100% would have noticed someone coming in. Nothing else was disturbed in the entire house. Nothing had been moved or taken. No signs of forced entry. My mum noticed nothing all night. She also has no sense of humor. There was nobody in the house aside from me and her. And nobody but us had the keys. We didn't have mice. And there were no traces of the missing lace anyway. There is absolutely no way that shoelace could have gone missing. My mum remembers it well. But as soon as I mention it, she immediately doesn't want to talk about it because it freaks her out. Either somebody broke into the house and did nothing except take a single shoelace. Or the house was haunted and a ghost took it. Not so much creepy as unexplainable. I have a memory of standing in my grandmother's suburban backyard with my cousin. We were maybe 3-4 years old, watching a line of penguins in a neighboring yard climb up a pool slide and slide down into a pool. One by one, they would swim to the stairs, waddle out of the pool and around the pool back to the slide stairs and wait in line to go down the slide again. I never mentioned the memory and assumed, because it was so implausible, that I dreamt it up or remembered wrong. A couple decades later, I visited my grandmother and this same cousin was also visiting. We were sitting at my grandma's kitchen table which looked out at her backyard. There was a lull in the conversation, and we were all looking out the window. It made me think of the whole penguin memory, so I brought it up. My cousin's eyes widened and she said she had the same memory, but, like me, thought it was a dream. My grandma chuckled and said, "Well, the neighbor that used to live there did work for the zoo." Double quote. Not exactly a confirmation, but did that really happen? Even if he did work for the zoo, you can't just bring a dozen penguins home. Can you? When I was growing up, I lived in a small bungalow with my parents. My room was directly beside my parents' room. I had a fish tank with a light and used this as a sleep aid. The dim light of the tank and the bubbling sound of the filter put me at ease. One night I woke up and I saw the outline of a man wearing a trench coat and a top hat standing beside my bed looking at me. Naturally, I screamed as loud as I could and my parents came running into the room and turned the light on and the man was gone. They comforted me back to sleep and that's all I remember about that. Fast forward 3-4 years. I moved my room to the basement and my parents knocked down the wall to make their room bigger. But they keep their bed in the exact same place. Over the next year, I would wake up to screams from upstairs and hear my mom crying. She would always see outlines of a man standing in the exact place where I witnessed it before. They even moved their bed to attempt put it where the figure would appear to stop it from appearing. It still scares me to this day thinking about that house and I'm glad I'm nowhere near there anymore. I can give you one that happened to my children. My identical twin sons once had the same dream at the same time. I had to make a 6-hour round trip drive. I didn't have a sitter, so the kids came along with. They slept for most of the drive. About halfway back home, I stopped at a rest area. I decided I should wake them up to go to the bathroom. I turned around to wake them and before I said anything, they both perked up a bit and opened their eyes. They started talking in perfect unison. "Dad, we should tell you about the dream we just had. We were driving down the highway and we saw 3 piles of bones. One was me, one was my baba, and one was my full name. I tried talking to them, but it was like they couldn't hear or see me. They were 3 years old at the time. Baba is how they said brother, and I was Dada to them. I'm not even sure how they knew my first and last name. I am convinced they were both sleeping when they said that. Even now, 6 years later, if one of them has a nightmare, I'll go into their room to comfort them. They will sit up and kind of wobble back and forth with their eyes glazed over and tell me about the dream. But when I talk to them, they can't hear me. I was so shook up there was no way I could have safely driven at that moment. We sat there in the parking lot for 20 minutes or so, then I finished the drive home. I still wonder if we were going to die that day. This story is my older cousin's and I'm sure he doesn't remember, so I'm not sure it counts. My grandpa passed away. Neither me or my sister got to meet him. The last cousin to have met him was my cousin I'll call Jay. Jay was apparently 1-2 years old and he was grandpa's favorite. The following week from when he had died, my family was creeped out by whenever Jay would call out no, what he called grandpa, and start talking to him. One time while his babysitter was taking care of him, he started calling out no again and the dogs even started barking when even at passerbys they wouldn't. She got scared apparently and said something along the lines of "Mothefka. Don't haunt me, sir. Please." Other family members would start talking to grandpa whenever Jay said no, begging him to leave since apparently he was this really funny guy who liked to scare people, and told my mom and her siblings he would haunt them for fun. Our family rule growing up was all 7 of us had to be at the table before anyone could eat. Everyone remembers me being forgotten in a large old spooky church. Not just once but many times. My family volunteered their Sunday afternoons to restoring a beautiful church after the service. They would finally remember me when they would sit down to Sunday dinner. When I was 3 years old, my grandmother died. She lived in our house with us and we were very close. She had told my mom many times that she would do her best to make her passing easy on me since I was so young. The night that she died, my mom was laying in bed with her and heard her take her last breath. My mom laid there and cried for about 30 minutes before coming into my room to check on me. It was about 5 AM and there was no reason for me to be awake. But I was sitting up in my crib playing, and when my mom asked why I was awake, I said, "Grandma Flo just came in to give me a kiss goodbye." Double quote. Big yikes. I had a neighbor friend who had sexual experiences with her cousin of the same age when we were super young, like under 10 young. I told her mom and the mom freaked out and called me a liar. Made a huge scene about how my parents let me watch rated R movies because they aren't in the church and that I made it all up for attention, and made me apologize to her daughter in front of my mom. Fast forward 20 years and I had some memory loss. So I was telling my mom about this weird memory I didn't know if it was real, where that girl told me about seeing her cousin's penis and how they would feel each other up at family sleepovers, and how I always thought she was assaulted or something, but have this weird memory of being called a liar and being forced to apologize for repeating what my friend had told me. My mom remembered and told me it all happened. I'm pretty sure the incest really did happen because I remember being so confused about why my friend didn't just tell her mom the truth. This is sort of embarrassing. My mom got an IUD after my sister and I were born. 4 years after my sister. A random priest stopped her in the streets and told her, "Why are you stopping Goddess Durga's will? She wants to gift you a son." My mom was understandably freaked out. It's not like my family didn't want a son, because trust me, Asian obsession with sons is real. It's just that they didn't want another daughter, so they weren't trying. Anyways, a few days later we had a curtain, sort of like a musical prayer meeting, and one of the ladies there got possessed by Goddess Mata, as Indians call it. Sort of like a trance possession, and the person possessed starts spewing all sorts of things that make sense but don't. Super creepy. Scary shit. So, that woman, a stranger, straight up looked at mom and handed her an apple. Said, "Eat it and get that foreign thing out. I want to give you a son. How dare you deny me of my wish?" Double quote. Word spread like fire about this incident. Suddenly half the town was interested in my parents' marital life. Small town. Mom didn't budge then though. My parents met another priest who they considered their teacher. He said that they should try and let what's meant to be happen. Well, I had a brother within a year. Most exciting 9 months for our town since we didn't know the gender. Gender testing is illegal in India to prevent female foeticide. Some of our family friends own a crazy old house in upstate New York that was actually part of the Underground Railroad. The house has a ton of history and secret passageways all throughout it. It's also haunted. Every time someone new comes to the house, wild things happen. My cousin has heard people breathing in his room at night when he visits, and the lady that owns the house constantly has to turn the TV off because the ghost, who they call Morton after one of the previous owners who had died in the house, turns it off. The youngest son tells a story where he was sitting in the kitchen and a large old china cabinet that was up against the wall where a door out to the backyard used to be, smoothly and silently swung forward like a door opening. He said it was just like someone was walking outside. Also, the youngest daughter slept in a room that had a hidden trapdoor underneath the floor for escaped slaves to hide in. Multiple times she has woken up to the rug covering the door flopped to the side like the door had been opened in the night. It's some crazy shit, but they all say that anytime Morton comes to visit it doesn't feel malevolent or angry. They say it feels like Morton is just living in his house still and they have to share it with him. They've lived there for 20 some odd years and have no plans of moving even in the middle of all this supernatural shit that's going on around them. I was raised solely by my mother. As a 6-year-old child I frequently had a dream where I was a man. I was riding a motorcycle in full gear along the side tall cliff. Or what looked like one to a younger me. I was going too fast and made a sudden turn. As I rounded the bend, a semi pulls out of seemingly nowhere coming towards me in my lane. I make a sharp turn to try and save myself but realize I'd go over the side of the cliff. I overcorrect and end up sliding under the semi while the driver attempts to gain control of his own vehicle. I feel my knee hit the pavement and hit my head on something underneath as I fall off the bike. The wheels approach. I stopped having the dream when I was 10 and stopped thinking about it. But I had told my mom about the dream at least 100 times by that point. When I was 17, my father was finally tracked down by child support agency and we found out he was the man in my dream. He was crippled from the waist down in an accident that went exactly like that. He spent a few years in a coma, which would have been from the time I was 6 till I was 10. He still wanted nothing to do with me after and begged to not be held responsible for child support, and we let him off. I wanted nothing from him at that point. I was however amazed I so clearly had been able to describe the events that happened to him even without having ever met him. My mom and I lived in Wilmington, NC for a few years when I was in middle school. Once in the middle of a bright summer day we were in our well-lit condo when suddenly it went pitch black. It lasted maybe 2-3 seconds, but it was enough for both of us to notice and remember almost 20 years later. It was like someone flipped the switch off and on for the sun really quick. I was in 7th grade when my parents bought their first computer. So not super young. We had a small ranch. So my dad built a corner desk in the basement in one of the finished off rooms since there was no room anywhere else. House was built by my dad in the mid-80s. No one had lived there before us. When my mom would get home from work, we'd hear her set down her keys on the counter and walk across the kitchen floor in her heels. It was a frequent occurrence for my brother or I to be on the computer, happened to each of us quite a bit, and hear sounds of my mom putting her keys on the counter and walking across the kitchen floor. Same as when she gets home from work. In going upstairs to check to see if my mom was home. She wouldn't be home. We would tell my mom when it happened. And it happened enough where we tried to figure it out by checking the time we'd hear it. A few times. She said she'd been thinking about work at that time and happened to look at the clock. We tried to figure it out and have no idea to this day why it would continuously happen. A few times my mom mentioned she'd be on the computer and hear someone upstairs. And no one would be home. My dad didn't allow pets in the house either. So it wasn't just a cat being a jerk. As a child, I had the same nightmare over and over. I dreamed that a group of evil men wanted to burn down our small town. They came to our neighborhood at night. They laughed and screamed. Haha, cc, which one should we burn first? Let's go kill some people, etc. And every time, my parents grabbed me and my brother. We ran in our pajamas to the forest. It was terrible. We had nothing to eat. It was so cold. I told my mom about this when I was 9. She turned pale. She told me this happened to my grandfather in 1945 in Germany. He was 5 years old. After Germany has lost World War II, Russian PPL came to the small village where he lived. They tried to kill all Germans as a punishment for starting World War II. The family of my grandfather had to flee overnight. They spent their first night in a dark forest, in their pajamas. They had to flee very fast. They couldn't take any from their belongings. He and his family surveyed. They joined a group of other survivors. It was very traumatic for my grandfather. They walked 30 miles in their pajamas to their relatives. They had nothing to eat. They almost starved to death. Until this day, we don't know why I had these nightmares. Nobody ever told me about this. My grandfather doesn't talk about it. The similarity is so creepy. I live in Puerto Rico. If you have visited or at least gone to pee, you know there are a lot of abandoned houses. Where I live there's one in at the end of my street. I can sometimes see a man just staring through a window and then disappear. And appear at another window. Sometimes I can see him on the roof of the house. The police came to check it out because a lot of people saw the same thing. And when they came they said no signs of somebody entering or leaving the residence. One weird thing they saw was a pair of running shoes being left at every window. I say it's weird not just because it's an abandoned house. The shoes were brand new, no signs of anyone wearing them. I can still see him at night. Sorry for the bad grammar, English is not my main language. The time my grandma got an egg, cracked it on a bowl and squeezed purple liquid out of a green leaf. I watched as the liquid formed a tree on the yolk of the egg. Wick had one branch with someone sitting on it. I mentioned this to my mom and she told me sort of spirit was haunting another relative and that it made its home in the tree next to their house. My relatives cut the tree down and burned it, which they learned had been rotting from the inside and someone left animal bones in the hole. My mum told me that she was once calling my dad and was alone in the house. Suddenly she gets a bizarre chill down her spine. My dad immediately says, calmly, I quote my mum here, "Darling, start recording." Nothing else. So she starts a video. And although there's clearly no one in the room and you can hear both my dad and my mum, there is definitely some loud breathing that neither person could hear but was picked up by the recording. And it was loud. Not at all tinny, so I don't think it was coming from the phone, and it continued in the same rhythm while my dad was speaking. When I get home from school I find a magazine on my bed. It was the August 1952 edition of the Autocar magazine. So I take it to my mum. And here's the weird part. It was my grandfather's. He had been dead 12 years at this point and my grandmother kept it as it was the last magazine he had bought before he went on his tour of duty. And the only one he hadn't thrown away before his death. No one had seen it in almost 5 years. I just asked my mum for confirmation and she did confirm this event, and now I am even more creeped out than I was 5 minutes ago.